Good morning, 7th grade. Welcome back. Today is lesson 21. We're hoping to finish chapter 11, but we'll see how far we get. Let's take a look at the questions. Yesterday, I believe we only got through 3 of them. So here are the questions. Yes, we got up to number 3, what comforted John? Remember, he said that in his letter, how Jethro, taking care of his boys, his one and only brother, brought him comfort. So question 4, what did Shad think of General Grant? 5, what did Shad think of McClellan's nomination for president? 6, when did the North begin to rejoice? 7, why was Lincoln reelected? And 8, what message did Bill send? So I do hope to get through all of those, but I'm not sure. We left off on page 165, and we were just getting into, I think it was the letter from, nope, it wasn't from Shad. It was comments made by Matt at the end. We're about halfway down. So Lincoln, remember, has put out this proclamation of amnesty, saying that any of the states in the South, if 10% of their voters say that they're willing to go back to the Union, he will willingly let them back. He's erring on the side of mercy, and Matt really respects that. So we're about halfway down the page there. Follow along with me. Keep in mind, it is currently December of 1963, so the war has been going on for about 2.5 years. The criticism of his act, Lincoln's Act, came with quick violence from all sections of the country. In the South, the Confederate Congress cried out that if the Washington government called for restoration of the Union, it was merely setting up a cruel trap for the deluded, that it would be only a relationship between the conqueror and the conquered, that it would mean personal and public degradation and ruin. And in the North, the chant of hate against Lincoln became stronger than ever. His proclamation of amnesty was little better than treason. The president's detractors shouted, and many people began to consider it high patriotism to talk of the coming wholesale execution of rebels. The third winter of the war went by with the echoing story of suffering and death. In the early part of the war's 4th year, General Grant was placed in command of all the armies of the United States. So now General Grant is the top general for the Union. With this promotion, another general fell to a lower place. General Halleck, who had never quite risen to his position, was finally relegated to the list of those whose names had soared for a while and then fallen into near obscurity. Jethro could remember the early days of the war when he had felt resentful upon learning that Halleck was Grant's superior officer. In March of 1864, so we're almost on to 3 years now, he felt a glow of personal triumph that his resentment had perhaps been justified. In Washington, Shadrach Yale was slowly struggling back to health in the safety of his aunt's home. Now that Jenny was with him, Shad's letters were addressed to Jethro. They were like gifts to the lonely boy. He read them over again and again, and then placed them carefully in the big envelope containing the president's letter. Shadrach wrote that he and Jenny had seen the president and General Grant as they drove through the Washington streets together. The president's face is deeply lined, and his cheeks are gaunt, like sucked in. I have seen so many soldiers whose cheeks have had that sunken look, even though they were young faces. The president looks at least 20 years older than the pictures you and I used to study together in the early days of the war. But his face was full of light as the crowds cheered. I think he knew they were cheering Grant, and that pleased him, for I guessed that he too wanted to cheer the little man who sat beside him. Grant does not have the appearance of a great general. He looks awkward, ill at ease, and carelessly dressed. But we have had enough of charm and polish. The commander who doesn't even walk like a military man is the one who will, I believe, restore the Union. Is he right? Do you know? Early in 1864, Talk of the presidential election was in the air. Jethro had been barely conscious of the excitement, anger, and vicious invective that had accompanied the election of 1860. Now he was fully conscious of emotions of even deeper violence in the talk of men in the community and in the papers that he read. There was hatred for Mr. Lincoln within his own party, as well as that in the Democratic Party. Thad Stevens, the aging floor leader in the House of Representatives, pushed his program of no mercy to the South and let his contempt for the president spill out in every speech he made. Midwestern newspapers reprinted the blasts of Wendell Phillips in the East and of editor Horace Greeley, who asked rhetorically if this man Lincoln was the sole hope of the Republican Party. The answer, he thundered, was in the negative. Did not such men as General Fremont, General Wade Butler, General Ulysses S. Grant rank high above Abraham Lincoln? The Democratic Party's strongest asset lay in the weariness of war throughout the country. Men lost were no longer counted by the thousands, but by the 100,000s. There had been blundering, betrayal, and corruption during the entire progress of the war. There was fierce resentment among many when the President and the Secretary of War used every resource at their hands to raise more troops to support Grant and Sherman. And with all these angers, there was an added agony when hopes for an end to the war were crushed as the year progressed. The country had waited expectantly that summer to hear of a decisive victory by its hero, Commander Grant. Instead, news came of the Battle of the Wilderness, a horrifying story of fighting in a blazing woods with losses mounting by the thousands and with Lee still holding firm. He had the sound of Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville all over again. Soldiers of the Army of the Potomac, loyal still to McClellan, had nodded cynically at the advent of Grant. Sure, they said, Grant looked pretty good in the West, but remember that out West, he hadn't met up with Bobby E. Lee. So Grant is now going to be pitted against Robert E. Lee. Now, in the Battle of the Wilderness, and later for a full month of fighting at a place called Spotsylvania, and along the Chickahominy River, and finally at a blazing crossroads known as Cold Harbor, Grant had met Robert E. Lee. And he was no more a conqueror of that legendary general than George B. McClellan had been. There was one difference, though. Grant would not give up. Remember, McClellan wouldn't advance and he would kind of back off. Grant does not give up. He gave his opponent no quarter. And the stubborn tenacity with which he held on in the face of Lee's punishment was something the soldiers of the Army of the Potomac had never seen in their idolized General McClellan. But for all of Grant's determination, the North appeared to be no nearer victory than it had been before the fury and waves of death had begun the month before. He had, however, managed to get away from Lee, and moving south had come up to the town of Petersburg. At that, Northern papers took hope and began shouting. Through Petersburg ran the railroads by which Lee's army received its supplies. If Petersburg were taken, then the cry of "On to Richmond" would at last be fulfilled. Jubilantly, the news came. Petersburg was in Grant's hands. Then a retraction. Petersburg was not quite in Grant's hands, only the outworks. And finally, a siege would be necessary before the city would be in Grant's hands. A moan of disappointment and despair went up over the country. The end of the war had appeared to be so near, and now, after the horror of the Wilderness and Cold Harbor, there must be a siege of Petersburg. The nation was ready to look for peace. If the price of peace was the dissolution of the Union, many people felt that compensation lay in stopping human slaughter. The Northern Democrats saw their chance. Lincoln had been nominated in June in spite of the reluctance of the men within his party who hated him. But in late summer, with the word of federal reverses pouring in, many papers shouted that he stood no chance for re-election. And to Jethro, it seemed that most men were agreed. So when they're saying he's been nominated, he is the one that the Republicans are going to put forth. to run for president. So we're going to wait and find out who did the Democrats put forth. Ross Milton was not, however. He said, Lincoln will win. When it comes to the final vote, the country will not admit that its sons have died for nothing. But Matt shook his head. I want to believe it, he said, but I don't. I think we're in the midst of an awful crumble. In Chicago, during the month of August 1864, the Democrats nominated George B. McClellan as their candidate for presidency. After days in which the Democratic nomination filled the papers, there came suddenly the thunderbolt of General McClellan's response to his nomination. Shadrach wrote of that response to Jethro. So these are the things that Shad says about McClellan. And in the previous letter is when he shared some of his thoughts about Grant. You know, he was disheveled, didn't really look like a general, but he thinks he's the one that's going to win the war. So let's see what he has to say about McClellan. I could not cheer General McClellan and Antietam. Remember, he fought under him as general. I watched the men who had been under his command for months and wondered at the love they felt for this man, who, to my way of thinking, had prolonged the suffering and bloodshed of this struggle through some aspect of his nature that lacked not the courage to face personal danger, but the courage to risk being wrong. Today, as I read General McClellan's response to the Democratic Committee, so set to elect him as an advocate of their peace platform, so they want to be done with the war, the Democrats, they want peace. I thought that I must write to you and point out a quality of courage in this man that I wouldn't have believed to be there. I gave a yell when I read it, and your sister was aghast. She said, but Shad, I thought you were all for Mr. Lincoln. And I had to explain to my dearly beloved and legally wed Jenny that I am all for Mr. Lincoln, but that today I had to give a belated cheer for my former commander. Shadrach sent a clipping from a Washington newspaper in case Jethro had missed General McClellan's response. The article quoted the general as saying that as far as he was concerned, the party's platform meant that the North was not to offer peace at any terms short of reestablishing the Union, that to accept anything else would be an insult and an affront to the thousands of soldiers who had died in battle. Shadrach added a note to the bottom of the article. This is the man whom the radical Republicans accused of traitorous disloyalty. So what does that mean? There's a lot, it's pretty high level words here. So the Democrats, they want peace at any cost, pretty much is what they were fighting for. They want the war to end. They don't care if the Union's restored. They're kind of willing to just say, let's stop fighting. We've got two separate countries. But McClellan is saying, no way. We have fought this long. So many of our children, our boys have died for this cause. We cannot do that to them. The only way we can have peace is to reestablish the Union. So that he is kind of on the same ground as what Lincoln is going towards here as well. He's not going to let our boys die in vain, which is why Shadrach cheers him a little bit. Like, oh, I didn't know he had enough courage to even stand up to his own party. So, but he's still going to vote for Lincoln. All right, at the bottom of the page. Then to the sullen and despairing North, there came heartening news. The first of which was to dispatch from Mobile, Alabama. In August, Admiral Farragut had led his fleet in the torpedo-infested waters of Mobile Bay to capture the Confederate Tennessee. And when it's italics like that, that is the name of a ship, one of the ironclad ships. And Farragut, if you remember, an admiral, he's in the fleet, so we're talking about boats here, said to one of the most powerful warships afloat. After that, land forces had captured 3 forts guarding the city of Mobile, which meant that the Confederacy had lost its most essential port on the Gulf of Mexico. In itself, the capture of Mobile might not have been a matter of such rejoicing had not other good news arrived upon the heels of it. But in September, word came to Washington from the excitable general who, months before, had annoyed Congress with his predictions of a long and difficult war. William Tecumseh Sherman, had telegraphed the president that the city of Atlanta, Georgia, had fallen to the Army of the Tennessee. Trying to decide if this is when they're starting to rejoice, because this is the heartening news, and that is a pretty important question within here that I don't see in our. It looks like it's in chapter 12. Oh, anyways, I'm going to point out that we've covered a lot of months here. So when we first started reading, I think it was December of 63, and now we're all the way up to September of 64. So we're quickly moving our way through the battles at the end of the last few years of the war here. Several things have happened. They've captured Mobile, Alabama, and Sherman has said that they have taken the city of Atlanta, Georgia. That we usually share quite a bit of information on when someone talks about the march to Atlanta. It was really not pretty brutal the way that Sherman handled things. And we're going to see that in some of the information a little bit. I'll talk about it more when we get there. Okay, so we're halfway down. Atlanta is ours and fairly won, was Sherman's message to Mr. Lincoln. And that, coupled with the news from Mobile, sent the North into pans of Thanksgiving. So yeah, I think those two that I've just mentioned, that's going to be your answer to number 6. News of victory also came from the Shenandoah Valley, where gallant, steel-nerved Phil Sheridan had defeated the Confederate general early at Cedar Creek. So Cedar Creek would be good news too. Sheridan had made a dramatic ride to rally his straggling troops and turn a nearly lost battle into a decisive Union victory. The North was still war-weary, but it was no longer hopeless. The prize was almost within its grasp, the goal for which its thousands of boys had died or suffered. The agony of prison camps was almost won. It would have been folly to give up with victory so near. So men went to the polls that November and re-elected Abraham Lincoln. So why was Abraham Lincoln re-elected here? They're so close to winning. We're not going to give up. Let's get Lincoln in there and let him finish this off. The preponderance of the soldier vote was for Lincoln that year. Preponderance is one of our vocabulary words. I think it's on next week's list, but it means the majority. The majority of the vote, or the soldiers voted for Lincoln. There had been unrest and anger, despair and desertion by the thousands. Still, when the vote was taken, the men whose suffering had been past all belief now took their stand that the war should go on. The news of that vote was heartening to the tired president. So too was the fact that all the northern states, except Kentucky, Delaware, and New Jersey, were of one accord with the soldier vote. So almost all the states in agreement, except for those 3, voting for Lincoln. That included Mr. Lincoln's home state of Illinois. But to Jethro's disappointment, it was not Southern Illinois that gave the state's electoral votes to the president. Even Sangamon County, where Mr. Lincoln had lived all his mature years, gave a plurality of its votes to General B. McClellan. After the excitement of the election, the papers began to speculate upon what had become of the Army of the Tennessee. It was lost in a mysterious silence somewhere in Georgia. There were rumors that the Confederate General Hood had encountered Sherman and had cut off the Army of the Tennessee to pieces. But they were unconfirmed rumors. When Hood came up from Georgia and through northern Alabama to Tennessee, he did not claim to have defeated Sherman's army. The Army of the Cumberland was in Tennessee, ready to face the same General Hood. And in command, it was the Rock of Chickamauga, General George Thomas. Some of Thomas's men had been to the Army of the Tennessee with Sherman. John wrote home that a lot of the boys were behaving like spoiled young'uns because they believed the Georgia campaign would be a lark with little fighting, while the Army of the Cumberland must stay on to do the stern work of keeping Tennessee in federal hands. Perhaps General Hood believed that the Army of the Cumberland, weakened by loss of regiments to the Army of the Tennessee, would be overcome and Tennessee regained for the Confederacy. Perhaps he hoped that Sherman would be recalled from Georgia in case General Sherman were too sharply threatened in Tennessee. Whatever the thinking behind the move in this bloody chess game, Hood appeared in Tennessee in November of 1864, and the two armies clashed at Franklin, only a few miles south of the city of Nashville, where Hood was worsted. Then another clash at Nashville in December, and it was from there that John's next letter came. The first page told briefly of the battle. There was days of sleet and we couldn't make a move. We sat there waiting and wondering what was gonna happen. Then the weather turned warm. As soon as the sleet was melted, we started the attack. The fighting was awful bad, but Hood's army, what there was left of it, was drove out of Tennessee and back down to Alabama. Tell Jeff not to believe that Grant is the greatest general in this war. I tell you, they don't come greater than old Pat Thomas. A second sheet was added to this letter, evidently days after the first had been written. It carried news that those at home had almost despaired of hearing. This is going to give you the answer to number 8. And notice what the question is for 8. What message did Bill send? So let's find out. We're hearing from Bill at last. But it's John that's writing it. It is late at night, but I have a story to tell, and I must write it because I can't sleep till I have told you. A few days ago, I was put in charge of helping to find the Reb prisoners that we took in this battle. Tonight, when I walked amongst them, I see a man that I swear to you I thought was Pa at first look. The man had a light-colored beard like Pa's was when I was a boy, and he had the same blue eyes with Pa's look in them. I stopped in my tracks and looked again, and then I seed it was my brother Bill, growed to look as old as Pa looked a few years back. I didn't dast to stop or take his hand, but I went close, and under my breath I told him I'd try to come back. And I think he nodded, but it was so little that I scarce could tell he nodded at all. Then I went to my captain and asked him if I could talk to a Reb prisoner that was my own blood brother. My captain looked at me. Your brother, he said. And then after a long time, he said, yes, I could go ahead. Well, I found Bill and we sat together with thousands of sad men all around us, and things was cold and foul everywhere, but we was brothers again, and we talked like brothers ought to talk. He wanted to know all the news of home, and I told him how Tom died at Pittsburgh Landing, and of Eb deserting and none going back. I told him how Jeff had writ a letter to the president and got an answer back. I told him about Pa's sickness and how boys was growing up fine with their good little ma bringing them up alone. I told him how Shad was near about kilt at Gettysburg and that now him and Jenny was man and wife. All the time his eyes was on the ground and he was saying nothing, but when I'd stop, he'd say, tell me more, John. And I try to remember more of what was in your letters. Then come the time when I must go, and we shook hands for a long time, like as if our fingers didn't want to let go. And when I turned to go, he called me back, and he asked me to be sure that I told this to Ma. And so I am writing what he said with the hope that it will bring comfort to her. Here's the answer, Ma. Bill wants that I should tell you this. He was not at Pittsburgh Landing. That bullet was not fired by him. So what is he saying there? Remember, Tom was killed at Pittsburgh Landing. Bill wants his mother to know he wasn't there. He was not the one to kill his brother. So there's your answer. There's the end of chapter 11. I went a little bit over 20 minutes, but I thought it would be good to end the chapter since I only had a page and a half left. So that's the end for this week. Please wrap up and get those questions submitted for me. Actually, I think I might have 10 through 12 together, but double check what the agenda says to do. Have a great weekend. Bye.